Thinking about planning ahead for hard times when the mental health burden is at the top. Because I mean, it happens. You've probably been there. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably like, okay, finally, let's talk about it. So, how can you plan ahead when you are well resourced, when you are able to do all the things and still feel like you have something left over for yourself? That's kind of the time to plan for when you don't have anything left in the tank and when you're preparing for the inevitable crisis that happens.
Welcome to Parenting Neurodivergent Humans. I'm Dr. Morgan Beidelman. I am a clinical psychologist, former school psych, former teacher, neurodivergent myself, and parent to two humans, one of whom is neurodivergent.
And I'm Breann Colpitz. I'm a school psychologist turned social coach for twice exceptional kids. I'm a mom to a couple neurodivergent kids and a late realized ADHD human, which means I'm double blessed with autism and ADHD. Thanks for being here. We're so glad you're here.
Breann, can we
Yeah.
just talk a little bit about some of the crises that some of our families experience? I'm wondering if it might help people feel less alone. And these are obviously not all of them, but families that I work with, we're talking about kids that have impulsively stolen their family vehicle. Unfortunately, suicidal ideation or non-suicidal self-harm. Also, family tension where the child is really upset and one or both parents are also upset, and now there's a lot of fighting and there's yelling and it dysregulates the whole family, and then people feel shame afterwards and it feels like it's just bubbling and boiling over, stealing of things, taking money, but also sometimes taking food, a disciplinary action coming from the school that feels outrageous to you as parents, and your child feels horrible about it. And also what actually happened doesn't match the report that's being said, because when the child was interviewed, they were anxious. And so everything came out all sorts of ways. There's a lot of things that can constitute a crisis. And really, what is a crisis is anything that is experienced by you and your family is overwhelming, and like you don't have access to your skills that you may have, because you could have the skills and just not be able to access them in that moment, or maybe you do not have the skills.
Yep.
And any of that is a crisis.
That's an important framing. Yeah, thank you for that. So if that's a place where you are, where you have been, I think recognizing your burnout indicators, me thinking about when was the last time I listened to music, or one of my acts of self-care is writing letters to people. When is the last time? And that was something I did so much before I had kids. I even have like the wax seal stuff, like the whole thing. It just kind of enables my stationary habit. But anyway, have I been able to write a letter to anybody in the past month? For me, also, if I don't know what phase that the moon is in, I feel unmoored, untethered. And I'm like, what day is it? What's happening? Like, I don't even know, like which way is up. Those are personal indicators for me. Do you have any you want to share?
Yes. So for me, really like to cook. I often batch cook. And then I have these moments where I'm just like done cooking. And before I would start shooting on myself, air quotes around that, then I would get into this tension between what I thought I should be doing for self-care and really being able to let go of that, put that down and say, oh, this is a non-cooking week. Maybe I'm ordering a lot of takeout. Maybe I'm getting a lot of boxed meals. And what used to become for me this like tension, because I would make myself try and do it, and then it would actually kind of like deteriorate my mental health even more, because I would kind of like force this behavior, but I wasn't in the mood for it, so to speak. And now I have kind of gotten to this place, at least right now, of radical acceptance around that. And that radical acceptance has been a game changer for me. And so something that used to be kind of like a flag for for kind of like a turning of the tides on my own mental health, because I was able to have radical acceptance and then shift into this is just a week that we don't cook. It's actually turned into a form of self-care.
Yeah, nice. I mean, one thing we know is that bodies cannot be in a constant crisis mode. We were not built for that. Our bodily systems cannot handle that. We're seeing more and more evidence that people who are spending all this time in fight or flight are ending up with autoimmune disease. Not a doctor, this is not medical advice, but I just think, I'm not trying to fearmonger here, but I just think there are some very real impacts of not engaging in enough self-care. If you feel like your life is a constant crisis, can you somehow evaluate, is this a regular crisis or is this a crisis, right? And so I think having some type of scale to measure, like, are we hospitalized right now? Is this something that happens a lot? Are we in outpatient? Like maybe those are something, ways of discerning like how much crisis you are in, because I feel like sometimes you need that to ground yourself a little bit. So I would invite you to come up with some type of crisis scale to know where you're at, because that might indicate how much support you need for yourself. And then also, as we were kind of talking about, like when you are in those well-resourced times, can you, if you're like Morgan and you're having like a batch cooking week, can you double it and put some of those things in the freezer maybe for when some of those meals, so when you aren't able to, and you have to feed people unpaid, can you buy like a gift card for a takeout place so that you have that just as a backup, like, oh yeah, I kind of have this secret gift card stash that I can use for supporting my community. Somebody else in my community is down and out, maybe I can do some mutual aid and support them in this way, but also mutual aid yourself, giving yourself resources if you're able to create a secret stash. I realize that takes money and planning. So when you have those things, is that like a tool you could use?
Yeah, even I have a really good friend and she goes to the store and she buys candies, like the chocolate candies where you open them and they have the little message. And that's her little act of self-care. I mean, she doesn't call it this, but I call it like, look at that mindfulness, because she'll like suck on the chocolate and read the little message. And she's like, don't tell me that hogwash. But I'm like, no, but it's what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up the concept that you said earlier that blew my mind. Yeah. Do you remember what that was, or you want me to say it for you? I don't want to
Oh,
steal your concept.
yes, microdosing self-care.
Yeah.
Yes, I really like this concept because at times in my life, I have thought, oh, I really need some self care. And my first instinct is to blow the whole thing up. I'm like, oh, I gotta go away for a weekend. And that's just not realistic. We don't always have budgets for that. That's a lot of time away. There's all these things. But what I actually probably need is moments every day where I'm intentional or I'm doing something that gives me a moment of, just a little bit of breather. If you ever have a pressure cooker and you hit the little knob and it goes,
Yes. Yes. A little release.
yeah, we need a little release. And those can be really small acts, like eating a piece of chocolate with a mess and reading the message, or the
Yeah.
ritual of making a good cup of tea, or whatever it is for you.
Yeah. I love the idea of microdosing self-care because I think that is a paradigm shift for me. And as someone who discovered microdosing mushrooms, psilocybin, as self-care for mental health, shout out to Moms on Mushrooms. So check them out if you are curious about that. It makes so much sense to me that like I can do this little moment and it will have an impact. And so I think, let's not get the whole idea of self-care twisted. Is it self-care or is it consumerism? That's something to think through.
Something that you said earlier, I just want to go back to, is the idea of creating a crisis scale. I want to just reiterate and highlight that as a very practical tool for many, many families. I know it kind of sounds a little silly if you are working with a mental health provider and you mention this concept to them, they might be a good resource to help you create it. But if you are living in a state that feels like relatively constant crisis or chaos, having a way to kind of figure out those scales for you, because one of the things that you're going to need to do to help your own mental health is shift your perspective of what the home or this time period is going to look like. And part of the reason that we have so much challenge around it is, like, one, usually there's a pretty significant safety risk or mental health risk that we are deeply worried about and is understandable. The other is there's this part of us that often is like, I didn't think it was going to be this way. I don't know what to do. I'm not good enough. This is not what I thought parenting.
Right. I don't know how to handle this. I'm
I
not
don't
built for
know what
this.
to
Yeah.
do. Yeah. And so being able to create that scale with a provider or a trusted other, a partner, even a good friend, and saying, okay, when we're at a 1, and 1 might just be a little crisis, right? What does a little crisis look like in our home? And then what are the supports that I need? And who can I enact? Who's on my team?
Yes.
And that can sometimes be friends, it can be family, it can be providers. It could also be like, this is when we bust out the paper plates and the
Yeah.
box of mac and cheese.
Yeah. And maybe this is when we send siblings on a sleepover at grandma's, or this is when we know we got to have respite care.
Yep. Even things like when my child is in therapy, I'm going to go to a coffee shop and I'm going to put my phone on silent for 20 minutes and read a book. If that does not feel safe for you, defining something that feels safe for you, even if it's a minute in the car, can be an act of self-care, but writing it out can create structure and a sense of stability in a very unstable time period. And I would really encourage families to consider doing that. And I know we said it kind of quickly, and so I wanted to come back to it.
I'm so glad you did, because I think I'm definitely going to use this with some of my parent coaching clients right now who are going through some stuff. But I just think if you're in it, you can't create the scale at that time, right? I think we could talk about this all day. Just remember microdosing self-care. I think that's an important paradigm shift. And I really agree with Morgan that creating that crisis scale can be such a useful tool, because when you are in crisis, you can't really use your prefrontal cortex to do all this thinking and planning and all the things. So that's got to be like a out of crisis plan ahead situation.
And if you're always, or pretty consistently in some type of crisis mode, the lower end of it would be a good time to create something. Or if your child is somewhere safe and you're needing a when they return home type of plan, that's also a good time to make one of those scales.
All right. Should we leave it here?
I think we should. Thank you so much for listening. We'll have another episode out next Tuesday morning. We're going to be diving deeper into what it actually means to say neurodivergent people are not broken and we do not need to fix them. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.
And if we are a good fit for you, join our community. We'd love to have you. You can find us on Instagram. Dr. Morgan is Dr. Morgan Beitelman, and Breann, that's me, is at It's Breann Colpitts.
As always, if you have a question or a topic you want us to cover, please send us a note. You can message us on Instagram or use the Google form that will be in the show notes.
If you are digging this podcast, it would mean so much to us if you could leave a rating and also a review. That really helps the show get pushed out to other people. And I also just want to give a special shout out to our editor and producer, Erica Carpenter. This would not be happening without you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week.
Bye, everybody. Okay, I'm going to go take a bath.
Just a quick disclosure, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute a psychological client relationship and should not be used in place of expert evaluation or therapy.
Number one, be aware of your burnout indicators.